Thank you for listening to the Archbridge Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wilternick, and today's episode, I'll be joined by Praj Kulkarni and Willis Krumholz for a discussion on the state of American higher education, how it's failing us, and what we might be able to do to fix it. So Praj is a writer and former space physicist living in the Denver, Colorado area. His writing focuses on the college for all trend and what he terms the academic approach to learning. He is currently working on a book project taking a closer look at the issues that we'll be talking about today with American higher education and offering some ideas for reform. Will is a research fellow with the Archbridge Institute, a licensed attorney, and a chartered financial analyst charter holder working in the financial services industry in Minnesota. Will is the author of several reports for the Archbridge Institute that offer policy solutions to eliminate marriage penalties embedded in welfare programs, the most recent of which focuses on California. So Praj, Will, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Ben.
Great. Well, I'll just get right into it then. Just to give listeners a little bit of context for this conversation, this really grew out of a discussion that we had after the publication of the winter 2022 edition of the Perfectus magazine, in which that edition I had an essay called Breaking Out of the College Box that kind of details some of these ideas. And so just to kind of do some level setting here, before we really get into it, I want to list off just a few facts of some of the most egregious ways that American higher education seems to be failing. So between 1980 and 2019, the cost of a 4-year college degree has ballooned by about 169%. U.S. student loan debt has now reached a total of $1.73 trillion, making it the largest category of consumer debt behind only mortgages. And despite these increased costs, earnings for workers between the ages of 22 and 27 over the past 4 decades have only increased by 19%. And more people continue to enroll and graduate college at higher proportions than ever. So that's kind of the broad overview. I think those are probably some of the most terrible ways that college seems to be failing us, at least what most people think of when they think about this topic. So with that kind of backdrop there, Praj, I'll turn it over to you to kind of get us started here. What's going on here and how can we fix it?
Yeah, so I would actually gently push back on the term failing.
Okay.
I think there are problems in college. I've criticized them myself, as you've read. But on the whole, people still seem to be making the bet that this is a good move for me. And for better and for worse, many employers still require, especially the type of professions a lot of middle-class professionals want to go into. So yeah, there are cost issues. And I would say the best ways to fix this are to recognize historically college and higher education in general. Now it's become college plus master's plus eventually, I hope not, but PhD to get a job, was designed for a certain purpose. It was designed to train the clergy. It was designed for basic scholarship and research. And whereas nowadays most people want to work. They want a better life for themselves, whether that involves working in finance, becoming an engineer, an accountant, or whatever, they want to get a job. And so I think there's a really fundamental mismatch in the purposes college was designed for and what it's trying to do now. And so academics and professors are aware of that, but I think it still is not something they've truly been able to work around. And I think my personal take is it's going to be very hard to solve that problem. If your goal ultimately is to advance scholarship, that is, you're going to run into some inefficiencies if the people attending those classes just want to work a 9 to 5. And so in terms of what can be done, less higher education, the better. And since you mentioned my academic approach to learning, a general critique I have is a lot of people who end up keep working in academia believe the deep understanding, the underlying theory, the theorem's way to learning is the only way to learn, whereas for a lot of students, the best way to learn is to actually start doing a certain task that is less theoretical, less abstract, and has a more meaningful, immediate impact.
Okay, I think we'll probably get into some more of the details of what kinds of reforms you think might work there. But if I'm kind of hearing your argument accurately, and correct me if I'm wrong, you would push back a little on the characterization as higher education failing us or being a failure. But you do recognize that there's a fundamental mismatch in terms of the goals of the institutions and what most people are attending them for, which is essentially jobs training, trying to get into a career path. Yeah. So let me kind of push back a little bit on that too, Praj. So I think there is that mismatch, but I don't think that you can really get away from the fact that basically, to kind of hop onto the Brian Kaplan train, who is a professor at George Mason University. He wrote The Case Against Higher Education. I'll make sure I put a link to that in the notes here. But he's basically saying that, college is essentially a signal. So it's not actually giving people the training they need. They're not actually gaining the skills that they need to succeed in a given career path. And so what we have is basically sort of an incumbent industry whose value is not in training or equipping with skills, but is signaling. So wouldn't that suggest, well, let me ask you, do you agree with that assessment that he's put forward?
So I like Kaplan's book. I think he provides a very useful insight, and he's largely correct. But this is where the devil is in the proverbial details. To a large degree, it's signaling. There is some human capital involved. So colleges are providing.
Right. Which he would admit.
Yes, which he would admit. So the extent to which it is signaling versus the extent to which it's human capital, I leave that to the experts to debate. I think he understates the importance of human capital, that people come out learning some very specific skills which are useful to certain employers. But I also say signaling isn't a trivial problem that you can just brush aside. Employers need a signal. My issue is that the way we've structured bigger issues, not that it is all signaling, even if we agree on that, is the type of signal it provides in the filters. The type of student who will succeed in college aren't necessarily the type of people who will succeed in the workforce. So that's where some of the mismatch is. And so in my book project, I describe people. I went to a state school for undergrad. I went to Penn State. And to be frank, I was a pretty good student. Ended up, going through academia and getting a PhD. But I met people who were incredible engineers who may not have been as good as I was at math. And so they may have provided a worse signal in not doing as well in their college classes, but in the practical aspects of engineering, they were incredible. And maybe they had other skills. So Kaplan is right. I think he overstates the signaling model. And so you can discount that. You need a signal. I've waded through resumes trying to hire people. We're looking to hire right now, and it's not an easy problem. So signaling you need some signal.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement there. So, Will, I'll turn it over to you. You can kind of take it however way you want. If you want to kind of take a look at, or chime in on the signaling aspect of this, or look at what Brian Kaplan has put forward, or what you think generally about higher education.
If I can just kind of step back to everything I for sure wanted to say, and then a lot of this is a response or agreement to what you both are saying, and some of it you guys might want to push back on. So I think predominantly about politics and policy when I think of things, and what's the current system we have now and how can we make it better. So if you think about kind of the current system right now and the flaws, there's inarguably a decreased return on investment that's occurring. And depending on the college and major you go to, that return on investment is negative. I think everybody would agree on that. A huge percentage of students aren't graduating in 4 years. And a function of that, or many don't graduate at all. So we have a huge amount of young people, and now older Americans too, who have student debt. And for young people, that's a big debt load right at the prime age of family formation. And so you have this student debt load for the college educated, and then, as Ben knows, something I've worked on a lot, a marriage penalty for the working class who are, if you're not going to college, you're increasingly subject to at least some form of the safety net, because how high into the middle class some of these programs reach. And so it's just really bad policy. On top of all this, college is increasingly not a force for greater social mobility. And there's been studies on this, and this is something we could delve into, but just think of the bribery scandal. I can't think of the fancy term for it, but the parents got in trouble for basically paying off school officials to get their kids in. But a huge amount of kids going to the especially if they're, let's just say it, especially if they're white or Asian kids, going to some of the country's best schools are highly connected. Parents had a lot of money, and so this isn't a meritocracy increasingly, and we could delve into that a little bit, and that is a problem. And then I'm just thinking of like politicians' kids, and they're all in Ivy League schools. I mean, that's not because they had good ACT scores, right? It's an obvious thing to listeners that that's the case. And then the other thing is that colleges are really increasingly an ideological indoctrination factory for the far left. And to the signaling point, what happens in colleges and a lot of what conservatives complain about with corporate wokeness and increasingly activist corporations kind of only on the left-wing side of politics is completely intertwined with the corporate wokeness is intertwined with what's going on in higher ed. And on top of that, this signaling mechanism, you can argue how strong it is, but it's a huge subsidy to corporate America. Because think about it, if you're a small business, you're not receiving thousands of applicants for an open position or hundreds or even tens of applicants for an open position. There's a lot more ability to sit people down, evaluate them. The bigger the organization is, the more you just want to be able to fit people in spots as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And this higher education system where there's a ton of brand credential attached to what school you went to is kind of, I don't know. I mean, I think it's fueling the over corporatism we have. So what to do about it, which is what I really want to talk about. I think often, and I'm a liberal maybe on some things, but very conservative on a lot of other things, and I hate even putting myself in the box because I just want ideas. But a lot of conservatives complain about higher education, think it's broken, think it's a problem, not just from the ideological perspective, from the results it produces increasingly. And what the problem is on the right is you have a lot of commentators, and I won't say this woman's name. She's done great work on a lot of things. I think she's at the Manhattan Institute now. She came to Minnesota and gave a talk a couple of years ago at an event I attended. And it was about how terrible universities were, how biased they were against Christianity and traditional family values, the West, capitalism. And so she had this big talk about the universities are just the worst thing ever. And at the end of her talk, a little old lady stood up and said what everybody was thinking, which was, what do we do about this? And no kidding, this speaker, who's a very, very intelligent person, and I don't mean to dump on her by any means, but her response was, well, you should homeschool your kids. And all the people sitting around me just kind of like, what? Right? Because you think about it, higher education you can't homeschool your kids for higher ed, first of all. And second, this is an area where there's a ton of government. We could argue about whether government should intervene in places it's not intervening already. But this is an area where there's billions and billions of taxpayer subsidies flowing every year. And this idea that this preeminent thinker who gets paid to sit and think about stuff in a think tank doesn't have any solutions about what to do about this stuff is a huge problem. Another example, the last time the Higher Education Act was up for reauthorization, and please, both of you tell me if I'm talking too long. I think Lamar Alexander was still in the Senate at the time, senator from Tennessee. And his big idea was to directly pull student loan payments out of people's paychecks, like Medicare and Social Security taxes, and then maybe free up things for private, for-profit colleges. That's a big thing that Republicans are for and Democrats are against. And so, even if you think those are good ideas, which I actually don't, what our policymakers are doing is tinkering around the edges of a massive problem, and then the conservative intelligentsia that people paid to go speak and think about stuff, they're not coming up with any solutions, and it's extremely frustrating. So I'll stop talking in a little bit, and here's my ideas, and then I'll shut up for a while. But I think number one, colleges should be on the hook for student debt if a major or field graduates a ton of kids. The statute would set the percentage, but a ton of kids who are underemployed or unemployed at least a couple years after they get out. So, for example, my former undergrad, Bethel University here in Minnesota, had a major that they've since discontinued called Reconciliation Studies. And they actively encouraged non-white students to become Reconciliation Studies majors. And the huge problem with that is you're underemployed and having a hard time paying off your student debt with this Reconciliation Studies degree versus somebody that, and some of these kids would have been great in these fields, versus somebody that went to a business or finance major. And that's a problem. And that school should be on the hook for putting a bunch of kids in a program where they're all underemployed or not employed in that field of study many, many years later. And you can argue about exactly how to implement that, but schools should be on the hook for that debt. The second thing is there should be more transparency. So something the Obama administration was working on doing, and the higher education lobby killed this stuff at the last second. It's kind of like the Trump administration with the disclose the medical prices, and the hospitals really pushed back on that, different kind of thing. So what the Obama administration wanted to do, and this should still be done, it's a great idea, and make it even go further than what the Obama administration wanted to do. But they wanted to require colleges to disclose basic information to students before they took out federal student loans, before they actually enrolled. So in other words, if I'm looking at college X and interested in major A, B, or C, I should be able to see after a couple years what's the average pay, what's the percentage of students employed in a field related to that major, how many years on average does it take to complete that major. So for example, at the University of Minnesota, there's majors where they say, well, it's a 4-year major, but the vast, vast majority of kids can't graduate in 4 years. And it's not because they're dumb or lazy, but the way it's set up, you kind of are stuck there for a 5th year or 4 years in another semester. So they should see how many years does it take to graduate. I could go on and on and on. You guys get the picture, right? That's something that has to happen. Both parties, there's no reason they shouldn't support that. It'd be easy to do. Colleges have all this money and all these administrators already, and they actually track a lot of this stuff already. Just make them track it. Have a uniform disclosure to parents, like a government website where you can go look and see what the details are on your major. There's kids that go to psychology majors and have no idea that you have to go to grad school to be a psychologist, right? That's a problem. So the next thing is, and I'm almost done with my big long speech, but tax deduction for principal paid off on student debt. So corporations get a tax deduction for the interest the interest costs they have. People with big expensive houses, if you itemize your taxes, you get a tax deduction for your home mortgage interest. And for example, I have a home and I don't make enough money to get that deduction, so it's a deduction for the rich. There's no reason there shouldn't be a deduction for young families that pay off principal on their student debt. And that could be sweetened for people who are married with kids. And then because we want to encourage family formation, and right now we're discouraging it. And the last idea, second to last, maybe less good than the other ones, but some kind of investment vehicle to pay off student debt. So just like a a retirement plan that your employer can tax advantage to contribute into, that you can contribute into. There should be something where you can't buy a bunch of crypto with it, but and not individual stocks, or certainly not options, but there should be something where you can put your money in a place, grow it, and then use that money tax advantage to be able to pay down student debt. And the final thing is a big solution to all this. Like, what do we do different besides making the colleges tighten their belts with, hey, if you produce a bunch of kids and they're underemployed, you're on the hook for it, and let's give parents disclosure. A big thing would be apprenticeships. And that could work in the corporate world. It could work for small businesses. There could be some sort of program, and the devil's really in the details. You can do it, and it works in Germany. You can try it in the UK, and it doesn't work. It's all about how the program's put together. But there's no reason why businesses can't get kids after only a couple years of school or 3 years of school instead of 4, and give them a lot of skills that they wouldn't have gotten in college. Or, like, there's no reason you can't learn a lot of this stuff on the job. And I just think about my experience. I learned how to write and reason better than I did in high school and college, but I've even learned more just working. And so there's a way to make this system work with the workforce better. And with that, I probably talked way too much. But I'd like to talk about solutions more than anything else. And I wanted to say that stuff. So I'm sorry for going on.
Yeah. I think it's helpful that you laid it all out there. I do think that it's helpful to identify the problems and what they are, and that will inform what solutions are most worthwhile for pursuing. And so I think we've laid a lot of stuff on the table here in the first 20 minutes or so. And I think it'd be helpful to sort of put some of these into some different buckets, right? So I think we can all agree that cost is one of the biggest factors. I think all three of us have noted that. Will, you were a little bit more interested, it seems like, in a couple other aspects that hadn't come up yet, which is sort of a cultural aspect of it, which I'm not sure that, well, we can talk about that, but I think there are some good reasons why the states, would want to keep some of that kind of thing at arm's length in terms of dictating too much of that policy. But let's start with cost, because I think one thing that gives me a bit of pause with some of the solutions that you put forward in terms of like investment vehicles or tax preferences for paying off the interest with that is, it seems like we're throwing even more subsidies then at these colleges. So we're trying to, I get what you're doing in terms of trying to make it cheaper for the consumer, but we've kind of tried that with a lot of expansion of Pell Grants and a lot of expansion of other things. And it seems like the result of those subsidies from the government has been to balloon those costs even further. So I'm worried that I don't see a reason why we wouldn't see a similar dynamic develop if we were to add even more government subsidies for people's debt on college loans. But I want to bring in Praj here real quick before you kind of get back to that.
Can I say something quick on that? I think there's a difference between directly subsidizing demand and doing these other things that will actually force colleges to tighten their belt, and at the same time helping existing student loan debtors do something in the realm of competition and not total just wipe the slate clean, which isn't fair to the working and the middle class that hasn't gone to college. There's a way to, that's the attempt there, but go ahead, Praj and Ben.
Okay.
Yeah.
Praj, what do you think? We've talked a lot about cost. That seems to be probably the biggest issue. Yeah. You want to chime in on that one?
Yeah. So it is a problem. I think it's a tough problem to solve as just anything else. And the ultimate way to drive down costs, I think you hit on it, Ben, is to stop subsidizing the demand. A lot of this, I think, comes down to personnel costs. So disclosure, I'm married to an academic, and I assure you, a lot of academics don't actually make that much, especially compared to what they could command in the market, especially for technical degrees, for example. You hear these things about bureaucracy exploding. Part of that is a function of the size of what colleges are asked to do in America is really quite impressive. They need, even a no-name state school will have multiple gyms and climbing walls and manicured lawns. And so I would agree with you, Ben, that driving down costs has to start with killing the incentives in terms of these unsubsidized, these over-generous loan packages that anyone and everyone can get. Will brought up the politics and policy. I think, though, what you're going to have to account for is that the higher ed lobby is real. You can't wish it away, and they're going to fight tooth and nail. So any realistic policy proposal has to somehow account for that. Do I have the solution right now? I do not. I think we will agree on the contours of the solution, but it is not an easy nut to crack.
One of the tough things is if you do anything to directly hit the demand side, that's going to be really, really politically hard to do. And I think just even like the disclosure piece, yes, that might cause more administrative work, but what that attempts to do is solve what this is, which is a third-party payer problem in a way, because students and parents don't really see the true cost of this stuff, especially relative to the return going into it.
Yeah,
and they're already starting to, but it's a very opaque marketplace in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I think you will naturally see certain majors and fields of study get prioritized versus deprioritized. But also on the counterpoint, if you look at the data, some of the most popular majors are the majors that have quote unquote practical value. Mm-hmm. People aren't necessarily flocking to reconciliation studies. It's there, mm-hmm. but the idea that they're relatively small compared to the business fields and the field like biology and engineering and accounting and finance. Those are the big drivers, and there's still a problem there. Yep. We still have people who fail out of those majors, join in, and can complete. So I think ultimately to address the demand for our education, the idea is to make it easier to find work. And not just, and I think it's fashionable amongst, Will, you and I probably agree on many things politically, to say, oh, we should have more vocational school. Not just to go become a carpenter, is how do you become a financial analyst without getting a 4-year degree? How do you start doing basic power circuit design without getting a 4-year degree? And that's where the apprenticeships model, can you create ways, and again, recognizing this will be a fight, where Pell Grants can be applied to work at a company. Mm-hmm. And they will train, training is hard. And again, that's something, Will, you and I both work in the private sector. It's not easy to hire. It's not easy to train, and it is a cost. So to go back to signaling, Ben, the reason I think my problem with Kaplan, even though I agree with him, is you can't just dismiss the importance of signaling. One bad hire can cause an enormous drain on your company's resources. So I work at a pretty small shop, 10, 15 people. A couple of bad hires, they could not put us out of business, but it's a big risk to our company. And so the signal helps us to lower that risk, which I think is a natural instinct. So can I hire someone who may not be the most experienced, but I don't have to pay him or her a premium, because there's a different way. Instead of going to college, they're technically savvy, pretty sharp, and they don't know everything as a 4-year degree, but they'll come cheaper. And so this is where making hiring easier and more fluid can actually help.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think, when I think about sort of this problem here, as I kind of outlined in that essay, I'm almost at the point where I'm willing to almost, maybe you guys can convince me here. It's just writing off American higher education, almost wholesale, and saying, what we really need to do is search for solutions. And I agree with you, Praj, that the signal is important. The signal is helpful for employers. Employers are going to look for signals one way or the other, whether it's a college degree, which it currently is. We're not going to get rid of that, nor should we. Yeah. It's just not going to happen. But what are some of the things that we can foster maybe alongside the college track to essentially make it obsolete? I guess that would be my vision for this is, let's make it so easy to hire people and fire people. I think that's important too. Yeah. We've got to reduce the frictions around the labor market so that it's not such a big risk hire someone. You can say like, I can take back that mistake if it doesn't work out. So I see that as a key component of this, that has less to do with reforming higher ed.
I think it's already really, really easy to hire and fire people. And again, politically making it easier is just probably not going to happen in this day and age.
I'm just not so convinced that it is. I mean, hiring somebody requires a lot of paperwork, a lot of onboarding. There's a whole laundry list of, protected classes that, I'm not saying that we should necessarily do away with all that, but I think that we should understand that there is a cost associated with litigation risk. And so if somebody can just say like, oh, I can make a reasonable case that I was fired for this reason that, has to do with some identity class rather than performance or whatever, like the more of those loopholes that there are in the law, the higher the risk of litigation, which means ultimately that there's a price attached to that, right? So I think that working backwards on some of that stuff, plus, then we have all these other, restrictions on, if they work a certain number of hours a week and you're a certain size company, then you're required to provide, health insurance or other things. All of these are employment frictions. So I think those seems substantial.
That stuff matters, but to me, not to
especially for smaller guys
back too much to what I was trying to say before, but I just don't. If we're creating a bunch of graduates, and even some of them, and it's still a big chunk, are going to be saddled with a bunch of debt and underemployed, I think we should care about that. And increasingly, there's a lot of studies and people that are saying that my college grads are not prepared for the workplace. They don't really know basic stuff. And I can say firsthand that, I learned how to be really valuable and add a lot of value at the workplace, not in school. And there's a limit to the theoretical in the school forever and ever. And there's got to be a better way to, within the existing framework, meld the two in some kind of apprenticeship system. And I just wanted to add to one thing I forgot. One politically possible way to fix the direct demand side is to make student loans dischargeable in bankruptcy. And it kind of has a populist spin to it, but what it actually would do is make lenders tighten their belts. It was made non-dischargeable in bankruptcy only, I believe, in the 2000s at the behest of the higher education lobby. And yes, the higher education lobby is real, but just for example, on the disclosure thing, if you go to parents and students as a Republican or a Democrat and you say, look, you should be able to see the details of the major or field that you're going into as a student or you're sending your child into, that would be wildly popular. So it's a matter of taking this stuff to the people and a politician who understands it and wants to run on that. That could be, I don't think AOC would do this, but an AOC or a DeSantis or whoever. It's definitely possible to do. But real quick,
I definitely think more transparency is probably helpful. I think I don't want to speak for you, Raj. That's certainly something I would be on board with in terms of just allowing some of that. But I think at the end of the day, a lot of that information is out there. Maybe not so specific to the institutions. So maybe that would be helpful. But I do think that people, if they're concerned about returns on investment, and if that's something that they're thinking about when they're selecting what college or what program to go to, it's not like it's a black box, or maybe I'm getting that wrong.
I guess I disagree with that because I remember I grew up in a small town in southern Minnesota, and especially if your parents hadn't gone to four-year college or they didn't go to there was an information, not like I got the short end of the stick, but there was an information that a lot of parents and people I lived around, including my own parents, just didn't have. And even for myself, I have a JD and an MBA, and I'm happy I have them both. I'm very, very happily employed, and I would think my employer cares about those degrees. But when I was going to, dumb example, maybe when I was going to get my MBA as well as my JD, it was very much made to sound like there were specific jobs out there for a JD MBA, and you could do all sorts of this stuff and that, and it opens up doors, and I think it's a good thing, I guess, to have, but that stuff just isn't true. And I'm not disgruntled about it, but as a 23-year-old or a 19-year-old, it's hard to really evaluate this stuff. So there's just a huge effort to be made just to disclose stuff, and then do something to hold people accountable for. College is accountable for bad product when they're creating it.
Yeah, I get it. So we had, again, a few couple of threads. To go back to something you said, Ben, reducing employment friction, I think that is a big one. Many of the things we have in terms of employment law historically do make sense. I think we need to be aware of that. There was actually a lot of discrimination against minorities, and so there may be in cases of adverse consequences, but that is tough. But so I would look at employment friction holistically, like benefits are a huge expense. Can we, and this is where my free market sensibilities come through, is why shouldn't people be in charge of their own healthcare? Why should it change when you get a job? That alleviates the burden on small businesses. In terms of getting more work experience, one thing, and I don't know, it's tricky to scale anything, but co-ops can start softening the edges towards you just do academic learning for 4 years. Can you intersperse that with working? Some other thing that I've seen other colleges experiment with is short-term certifications that can be then used in the labor market. So here is a one-semester boot camp in X. And so it's coming up a lot in certain technical fields, like data science boot camps are huge now. But I do think part of this comes back to the Brian Kaplan problem, is the people who will succeed in this, are we just self-selecting for the people who would succeed anyway? So is it that the people who are graduating from college and the people who aren't, is it that college appeals, that type of environment appeals and is suitable for a certain type of student who like academic learning, which was my hobby horse, that a lot of people, even if they're plenty smart, just don't like sitting in a classroom and getting lectured to, and who do have a baseline pretty high IQ, versus are we training them and are we able to train them? So that's where I would say, well, it's tricky to say that colleges aren't providing a good education or training them. It's a selection problem. The kids coming in may be better trainable.
And I don't mean to say they're not providing some training at all. I don't even know if it's a problem we need to answer, because it's to me more clear that it's relative to the student debt issue created, relative to people being saddled with student debt who don't have good technical learning majors that they've gained, that there needs to be reform. I think it's partially true that you gain skills in college. You certainly do. It's also true that it's a signaling mechanism for employers that disproportionately favors bigger employers. They're not mutually exclusive. It's just what are the benefits of those things relative to the costs. And I think it's a relative game. And I think increasingly in the last 40 years, the learning part of it, the benefit has gone down relative to the cost. And again, to me, it's hurting people. I'm fine. I'm really happy with my education, but there's a lot of people out there that aren't. And it's a public policy issue because of that, because so much taxpayer money is flooding into it. And the solution on the other side is let's just forgive all the student debt. Well, that's a massively bad idea. It's rewarding people that already make disproportionately more. It's bailing out the colleges essentially without fixing the root of the problem. So, yeah, I don't mean to go back to the solutions. I don't know if they're all for sure perfect, but there just has to be something that's done to reform the system, even if we eventually want to go outside the system and do something different, because it's a public policy issue that's just not going to go away.
Yeah, I think that we've hit on kind of a key maybe differing viewpoints here where I guess there, on the one hand, I'm not against, reforming the system. I definitely like some of the transparency stuff in particular. But on the other hand, I'm just so much more bullish on like alternatives that are coming up or just different things where I'm just like, I almost want to say like these other things are I hope that other alternatives can make them obsolete within 15, 20 years or something like that. And, to the extent that we're seeing some of that happen with those certifications, maybe this problem is kind of solving itself. But at the same time, I still think my impression is, and I think the data bears this out, at least for now, the vast majority of employers will not consider you if there's kind of that baseline. Do you have that degree or do you not have that degree? And until you can get around that, I guess we're going to have to be in this discussion about reforming the system.
Yeah. I completely agree, Ben. That's right.
So what do you think, Praj? Do you think, okay, so we've talked about transparency a little bit. One thing that I want to talk about is, Will, you mentioned the accountability component of this, right? So you have the student loan forgiveness on the one side. You kind of floated an idea about making colleges liable, I guess, in a sense for I guess the details would have to be worked out, but there's some form of liability that the college would bear for graduate outcomes. And correct me if I'm getting that wrong. I'm nervous about that solution because I think it's really tough to sort of disentangle, once a student leaves and graduates, trying to, they're not able to get the job that they want, or they're not able to earn the income that they want. How much of that is on the student and or the graduate, I should say, and their efforts, or the labor market in general, or is it the fault of the institution? And pulling those apart in a way where you have like real financial damages that are going to be paid seems insurmountably difficult.
Can I go real quick before you say something, Praj?
Yeah, please.
It's as simple as this. The stuff that Praj cares about that I could never do. The real stuff that makes the world go round. All those kids, those students are fine. But colleges have a ton of majors and a ton of kids going through majors that don't match up to the labor market, that leave people saddled with debt and in low-paying jobs. And that's just objectively true. I wish I had all the numbers in front of me, but I know people that have gone to the U of M, and I've seen the books in their curriculum, and it's worse than you think it is. And taxpayers shouldn't be subsidizing that. So to make colleges on the hook for debt isn't because a few people didn't do the right thing or didn't work hard enough. It's because an entire crowd of kids went into a major that the college never should have been offering in the first place. And it's a populist spin on what in reality is saying to colleges, we're not going to taxpayer subsidize this stuff if you're producing this stuff and it has bad results. And that's as simple as it is. But So I
hear you saying, where I would push back on is we're essentially maybe blaming colleges for what is a broader cultural problem. All of us, society values college. And no one held a gun to these kids' head and said, you have to apply for college. They got this message, you should go to college. They wanted to apply, and colleges, in a sense, organically responded by building capacity. And they got there, and, they couldn't solve differential equations, and they said, we need to go to college. And so we maybe over time, a major came up.
These aren't majors.
And on the other hand, we're pushing to train people in accounting or train people in resolution. Yep. So
these aren't majors with differential equations. These are, it's theoretically everything you're saying is correct. And this is kind of my point about on the right. A lot of people kind of talk about the theoretical stuff. And I agree with everything you said. In actuality, the U of M has a sociology major. And everything in that course is garbage. And taxpayers are subsidizing it. And a ton of kids are going into it. And it's not because they're dumb kids. It's because they're being told, and this still is out there today, big time. You go to college, figure it out, you'll get a job, it'll work out. just you have to do it to get a good job these days. It's still true. It's less true than it was, but it's still true. Actually, it's not less true than it was because you used to be able to get a good job without going to college. But theoretically, you're right. But in practice, the reason this matters is because it's taxpayer subsidized.
I see
and
what
colleges should be on the hook for it because whether the students are making a bad decision, I'm the U of M, so what? I'm just putting this sociology course out there and the curriculum is garbage. But where it stops being theoretical is the taxpayers are subsidizing right now. Massively, big time.
Yeah, I see that. I guess I still wouldn't necessarily blame the college. And let's define by it's garbage. What it means, I think you're saying, is that they're pretty smart kids. They don't teach you getting a sociology major at a state school does not teach the kids skills that have a lot of employment value. If you want to go study sociology, maybe, but they can't get jobs in sociology or even have skills that they could go use elsewhere.
And it's more than that. It's ideological indoctrination, right? If you're a sociology major at the U, you'll take a course where one of the 3 books is called Capitalism's War on the Earth. And so never mind the fact that the Soviet Union and communist China are the worst polluters ever known to man. And I'm not saying capitalism is perfect, and I'm not saying our country has a perfect environmental track record. But people are literally taught stuff that just isn't true from a political stance that is extreme even in the Democratic Party. It's not like they're just being taught one side and the other side doesn't like it. What your average college professor believes is what less than 10% of the population of adults believes. And increasingly, a lot of these courses and majors are being used to indoctrinate people or to bully people that don't. I mean, and I'm not saying this as like somebody that's ranting about critical race theory. I went to a private Christian school in Minnesota, and I dealt with it myself. And it wasn't like, I was a teacher's pet, don't get me wrong, but this stuff is everywhere. And it's like it's very simple. The taxpayers shouldn't be subsidizing it.
Let me jump in here. I know, Will, you probably have to head off soon here. So I want to give you kind of a final word. But before I do that, it seems to me like there is maybe a distinction that we can draw between, these college degrees are not giving people marketable skills that they can then use to earn income and advance in their careers. And they're teaching, crap indoctrination. Do you see those as different? I see those as kind of different problems that probably have different solutions. So in answering that final question, I'll let you kind of give any last word that you'd like on that as well.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. I think it's a similar problem just because taxpayers should be subsidizing something better that best serves the interests of students. It's not mutually exclusive. It's because of how ideological things have gotten, because of a lot of majors which are very, very, can't think of the term, but, not hard science-ish. That also is what's creating a lot of waste and then hurts young people who have a lot of debt then, and they're delaying getting on with their lives because of it. So I don't think you can separate the two. And it's a huge issue that I think if colleges weren't so biased one way, both sides would care about it. And it's kind of stunning to me, given all the taxpayer subsidies, that people on the right, Republican politicians, aren't coming up with more unique ideas to try to at least make this thing more efficient, not in a hard-nosed, we don't care about people way, but more efficient because the current system's hurting people. And I'm going to listen to everything. I got to go now, and I'm going to listen to everything you guys say after I go and re-listen to this. And Praj, I really look forward to reading your book. It's been a pleasure to know you over the years, and thanks, guys, for dealing with me being off and on here. So thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. Well, we appreciate it.
Yeah. Have a good one.
Yeah. Bye.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
with Will gone, we'll kind of continue. I don't want to push back too much on some of that. I think I see it a little bit differently. But with him gone, I think we'll have to save that for a round two or part two later on some other time. Let's
to just follow on one thing. I do like your framing. I think it's important to segregate the various problems. And
I think
there's the same solution. Then we can overlap the solutions. But I do think the ideological indoctrination, that is, even if I agree that is not something that is a lesser problem for me, because I think the flexible labor markets, the making sure the signal is valid, provide that people are getting marketable skills if they are choosing to go to college, trying to make it easier to get jobs without having a college degree, those are more important for me. Not saying I don't necessarily care about the other one, but yeah.
Okay, so with those in mind, I think that those are a little bit more in line with what I see as some of the bigger problems. I mean, I think the fundamental problem that we're in right now is, we've subsidized college to an extreme degree, and that's driven costs through the roof, and it's also driven enrollments through the roof. We don't have good evidence that human capital is the major component of what people are gaining. In fact, there's some evidence to the contrary of that. And yet, because of its function as a signal, it's most career paths, I think, that people would like to get into. And I'm generalizing here a little bit, but I think it's generally fair. People feel boxed in that they need to jump through these hoops and get that degree, get that signal so that they can get a foothold into wherever they want to go. So that seems to be, in my mind, that's kind of the fundamental problem that we're in. Transparency can help. I see the solution as alternatives that will sidestep this. But if you could maybe give me your top one or two sort of proposals to kind of get at this problem that we haven't covered yet, what would those be?
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is we need to get from there to here, you need a few steps. So rather than saying we'll eliminate that wholesale, I would take ways to soften the requirements of education. So instead of a 4-year degree, have a 3-year degree. I don't know if this, like in my ideal world, I would say college, you can have loans for X number of years of college. I've read an interesting proposal by Rick Hess. He's an education scholar at AEI, where we use some of this civil rights legislation and say using a college degree is also an act of discrimination. Because that also has a disparate impact. I like that idea. A lot of advanced schools, like medical school, will require a 4-year degree. So you can't do that. You should accept it. You have to accept an associate's degree. Here's what I've been mulling over. I haven't worked out in detail in any significant way, but for federal projects, like through major federal contractors, say a certain percentage has to be staffed by people with no more than associate's degrees, and a maximum percentage of people with college degrees. So basically, you're starting to shift towards lesser education. I don't think we're going to very quickly, and I'm not even sure I want it to go from, which is now all college, to no college, but I think I'd like to have a world with less higher education. And the main reason is I think we need people to be working sooner. It's not just that college doesn't teach good skills. One of my core arguments is that type of teaching that colleges have to do, because you're sitting in a classroom. Even if they try to be innovative and have labs and case studies, you're limited, and it's not in the real world. You're in a classroom environment. Is not as good as the education you receive while working. So education just doesn't happen in school. It can happen elsewhere. So to start pushing people out of classrooms and into the workforce, I would say there are a number of policies we should pursue there. Okay.
I think I agree with that. I think your solutions, I think, accurately get at the right problem. We need less, let's say, formal education.
Yes, less formal education.
I think that is definitely, I think that's exactly right. Now, I think there are, as I'm sure you're aware, there are trade-offs that are, involved in each one of those solutions that are kind of on the table there. So I think, as much as I like Rick Hess, and I think he's got some good ideas, I'm a little worried about the whole, we we should disallow discrimination by college degree because of disparate impact. That rubs me the wrong way just because I don't really like the disparate impact stuff. I think that it's a legal abomination that because you're reducing identities down to a single characteristic, and then you're highly incentivizing people to sort of see themselves in a certain light because there's a huge benefit if you can't. So I'm a little less sure on that one. Where I think I would have some trouble is I think we agree that it would be a better world if employers put less stock in the 4-year college degree signal. But we can't really wave a wand and just say, find a new one or disregard that signal. I think, where I'm very interested is, pulling the levers that we do have some control over, which is the government sector. So maybe I would say alter, I'm a little leery on, saying that federal contractors might need to have like a certain number or a certain percentage of contracts that go to people that have less than a certain, formal education threshold. I think that could potentially distract from other things that we want to prioritize in terms of quality from those. But let me maybe alter one of the things that you were kind of talking about, which I would say maybe
these are all somewhat off the cuff ideas, by the way.
No, that's fine. I'm not going to hold you to any of these.
Well, we're revising them.
Yeah. So listeners can chime in to let us know what they think. But I think maybe one way to kind of get at that, and I realize that this is a little bit around the edges, but maybe for certain government jobs, whether that's whatever, pick your level of government. Do away with the formal 4-year degree requirements for those jobs. Because that quite literally is something where we can just wave our hand wave the legislation to say, you are no longer allowed to, consider this dimension of qualification or this particular signal in your hiring practice. Now, I'm sure people would, push back on that for this or that reason, but maybe you could make it for only entry level employees or something like that. Yeah. I think there's some ways that you could start to kind of get at that. And, as far as I'm concerned, you're not harming, you're not kind of sticking government fingers into these private sector entities and telling them how they're allowed to hire or not hire. But you're saying, this is going to be our policy as, the municipality of whatever. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. I think you bring up valid concerns. But what I would say the bigger point is this sort of thinking is what's important. We're recognizing the problem and iterating towards a solution. So, and something I haven't hit on, Will did quite a bit, is there is a cost to staying in school longer and longer. There's a personal cost, not just a financial cost, which you've belabored. You do often start your life later. And if we recognize that, I think we both do, that education also happens outside of school, you're robbing yourself of that type of education. K through 12, you sit to stay in a classroom. That's great. Then you go 4 years of college. Now an MBA, what I think is sad is now an MBA and a master's degree is becoming even mandatory. And that's just, I think, a terrible trend.
No, I think we're in total agreement. That's a terrible trend. You are robbing yourself of perhaps even more valuable education that's not formalized. But that education doesn't get you the interview.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of a key hurdle that we're going to have to overcome. Yeah. And so, but I agree with you. I think, step one is kind of talking about this problem a little more openly in these terms. I think, Kaplan, for as much as we might, disagree or agree with his thesis, I think that putting that out there and just kind of getting people to talk about this a little more and think about it a little more has done an amazing service to this issue. So with that, I just want to, thanks for coming on here, and I'll close it by just asking you any sort of final thoughts that you want to leave listeners with, or maybe if people that are listening to this podcast are working in and around state governments or local governments or anything like that, any final sort of imparting words that you want people to think about, any recommendations for things you want them to read. So I'll kind of give you the last word, and you can take that where you'd like.
Well, I'm trying to ramp up my writing on this, so
we'll definitely have you back when you make more moves on that.
I was talking to a friend of mine, and what I would say especially if you're in state governments, there are oftentimes laws on the books in state governments where you can't consider people for jobs without a college degree. So I have a friend who was interviewing for an engineering job, and it was with a state government, and they loved his qualifications. And at some point during the first or second interview, it came out he didn't have a college degree. He'd been working in the field for many years, and he was SOL, to be blunt. So there are legislations that I think that can be tweaked to solve some of these problems, to at least on the margins when it does arise, the problem does arise, you're not impeded by a degree requirement. And so if I had to say one thing, to the extent we can make small changes now, let's try do it.
Yep. Well, I think that's excellent advice. Excellent place to start. Praj, thank you again for coming on.
Thanks, man. This was great. Have a great rest of your weekend.
You too.